Let's start this video by saying that when I saw the Too Faced Pumpkin Spice palette, I was a little bit in love. I think that it is probably the best color story of any of the chocolate bar palettes. Well, it's definitely the best color story of any of the chocolate bar palettes, in my opinion. But I think it might actually be my favorite color scheme of any of the Too Faced palettes. And that to me was a giant, glaring indication that something was wrong. Because despite my outfit and general look today, really don't like warm colors. It's strange to me that I ended up really liking a pumpkin spice themed palette. That is something that really shouldn't be up my alley at all. And then this week we got another indication that something was not going particularly well with this chocolate bar line when Morphe released essentially their own chocolate bar palette. I'm not quite sure what drove the thought process of, oh, we have a cherry Coke themed collection, let's make it look exactly like Too Faced's chocolate bar palettes, but who am I to question the wisdom of Morphe Cosmetics? That in itself isn't particularly worrisome, but what is not great was looking through the comments. People liked the colors in the Morphe palettes a lot more than they seemed to like the color schemes of the last two large size Too Faced chocolate bar palettes. So the pumpkin spice and the gingerbread extra spicy, I think it's called. Do you know how bad something has to be before the internet starts liking Morphe more than you? Just take that in for a second. So in this video, I thought that I would offer up some concepts for Too Faced chocolate bar palettes. I have put some mock-ups together. If you've seen one of these videos, the 4 naked palettes that should exist, or the BH Cosmetics one that I did, it's the same concept. But I think we will start by revamping the pumpkin spice palette. Revamped version of the pumpkin spice palette that I actually like a lot less than the original. Sad for me, good for people who actually like pumpkin spice themed looks. This palette, I started with the column of oranges. That is 3 from the left. I wanted a really vibrant matte orange, a shimmery orange, and then what I think has like a pumpkin cinnamon color, which is the matte at the bottom. And then I built out from there. The right half of this palette is largely yellow toned. To me, these really yellow tones, slightly grungy colors really bring out fall. They just feel like scarecrows and hayrides and all of those like obnoxiously Instagrammable fall moments in exactly the same way that a pumpkin spice latte does. And on the left side, to make this a little bit more palatable for someone like me and to tempt myself to actually want to use a color scheme like this, I added some more rosy shades. This keeps to this fall theme by going more of like a rosy bronze than the standard rose. Don't worry, there will be plenty of rose later on in this video, but for this palette I wanted to keep things a little bit more fall. I think that there is a nice range of depths in this palette. There are some really, really light shades. You have a super light matte yellow, almost a white, a really light peach, and a light gold to use as lid shades or as inner corner highlights. But you also have some really quite deep shades, both in shimmer and in matte form. I know a lot of people don't really have a use for a shimmery, deeper color, but I like using them as liners and to deepen up my outer V. I just like the way that they blend in with a lighter shimmer a little bit better than I sometimes like a matte. Now that we've gone through the one mock-up in this set that I actually wouldn't be tempted to buy, let's get to the things that would quite possibly actually be separating me from my money. I think we're going to start with the aforementioned Rosie Palettes. Is, I think, an interesting color scheme because to me it reads as equal parts spring and fall time. I think that makes it versatile. I mean, that's half the year right there that I see it really catered towards. And of course, you can, and I hope you would, be pulling for this lots of times of the year. Like the rose that this is themed around, we have quite a bit of pink, but we also have the foliage that surrounds the actual bud. So plenty of greens, there's a little bit of brown, and then just for kicks, I added a little bit of yellow as well because I thought that just added a couple of more interesting notes. I think that a yellow and pink look is quite pretty. I also think that with the yellow and green, you could get that really standard sort of melt Gemini kind of golden green eye look that I think the last few years in particular has really become a little bit of a staple in the beauty community. But at the same time, you could go in with that deep forest green and one of the pinky shimmers and get like the most stereotypically spring look imaginable. Clearly, I think this is really pretty. I think that this would do really well for Too Faced if they were to choose to release something quite similar, because it's fairly neutral. I mean, there are almost no shades in here that I couldn't see even someone who worked in a relatively conservative office environment not being able to wear to work. But at the same time, there is enough color in here that you could go pretty bold with color. I mean, the fact that this has pinks and reds and yellows and greens in it means that there are a lot of different directions you can go with this palette. However, there really aren't any two colors in this palette that I couldn't see myself using together in a look. I think that this is really quite cohesive for how colorful it actually is. I tried to do that with all of these palettes to keep them in this a little less than half neutral, a little more than half colorful sphere, because I feel like that's really approachable for a lot of users. And I think that the entirely colorful palettes especially can be a little bit daunting because sometimes you do just want a neutral matte to blend out your crease, and a rainbow palette is very, very pretty, but it may not actually have those. I think I'm gonna save my favorite one for last, just to keep y'all in suspense. But the next one we have is right up there with it. I think the other one just edges it out a little bit. This is a blueberry themed palette. I will acknowledge that there's only really a couple of blues in this palette. However, it is not a blue palette, it's a blueberry palette. And if you have ever seen blueberries and then things like blueberry yogurt, I would argue that the left portion of this palette, the one that's really more purple, might be more accurate to the actual fruit and the foods that result from it. That was a weird way of saying that, but we're just gonna roll with it, than the blues on the far right do. In any case, I think that these would play really well together. I love this more grayish toned blue. I think that that would be really quite wearable for a lot of people for every day. And I love purples. Really, blue-based purples are probably some of my favorite colors, period, but especially in eyeshadows. And I think that this has a nice range of them. We do have these more red-violet purples on the very far left, but that next column is so up my alley. You have a little bit more of a pinky lilac, a little bit more of a blue lilac, and then a blurple matte. I could have a lot of fun just with that column, but especially once I have the neutrals in the center. So this pink, this brown, and this cream shade-ish, all of which have this sort of purpley undertone to them to tie them together with the rest of the palette and to stop it from feeling like that Neapolitan ice cream palette that everyone seemed to put out a few years ago. I don't think any of them were actually themed around Neapolitan ice cream, though I could definitely be wrong. I haven't exactly looked this up, but that white, pink, and brown highlighter combination that so many brands came out with, you know, the one that was like too frosty white, too bright pink, and then the brown would have been a decent color for people with darker skin tones, but those same people wouldn't have been able to use the white and quite possibly the pink. Those palettes. I really wanted to avoid that look in this palette, and I think that these slightly purpley gray, I guess more taupey undertoned neutrals add something a little bit different to a lot of people's collections. I think these would be really fun, useful, and interesting shades to pull into looks that didn't necessarily involve the more colorful shades in the palette. Also, I suspect that in the picture that I'm putting up, the sort of red-violet shimmer and the purple shimmer that's on the right side of the palette are looking pretty similar. They really aren't similar at all in a side-by-side. The one on the right side is definitely more of a purple gray, while the one on the left is much more reddish, but I just think that in conjunction with the other colors around them, they are pulling very similar in the palette itself. Okay, finally we get to talk about my favorite of the 4 palettes that I've pulled together. This is the kiwi themed palette. I can't say that this really looks particularly like a kiwi, with the exception of maybe like 2 shades, really the 2 shimmery greens on that top row. Otherwise, it doesn't look much like a kiwi at all, but I do think that it looks very, very pretty. These are so up my alley. These are exactly the kinds of shades that I get excited about, that I love to play with. We have these light greens. We go a little bit into aqua in that bottom left corner. We have this sort of periwinkle duo on the right, and then more purple because, as discussed earlier, I really do love purple. There really aren't those sort of neutral brown mattes in this palette. They're all green with the exception of the blue and the purple, so no browns here, but they all have this really muted quality that I think would allow them to function really well in the way that you would likely use neutral mattes. So blending out your crease, maybe smoking out your lower lash line as liner, you know, your general neutral matte duties. But I think that it ties them with the more colorful shades in the palette in a really, really pretty way. I think that the inclusion of these 3 more neutral shimmers, so a gold, a silver, and then this really interesting sort of ivy greenish silver, would make this really wearable for every day, even if you did work in more of like a corporate job. And just overall, I want this so badly. I don't think that I really have the singles to dupe this palette within my own collection, But I might need to try that because I am all about this palette. I think this kiwi palette would be gorgeous. And there are my mock-ups. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you will let me know what you think of these, especially if it's positive, but you know, if you don't like them, fair enough, you can absolutely share that. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and I really hope that I will see you in the next one. Bye!